Now, there's cheering news out of South Africa as the continent's most industrialized economy cut its headline rates by 25 basis points to 8%. That took South African banks' prime lending rate to 11.5%. But what are the expected wider impacts on, or what is the expected wider impact on the impact of that rate cut on the economy? The country's repo rate, of course, is another thing that needs to be discussed. Our guest tonight, of course, is Chris Hart. He's the executive chair at the Impact Investment Group in Johannesburg. Good evening to you, Mr. Hart. It's great to have you on the show. So I guess with the rate cut that we saw, was that in line with your expectations?
But I was possibly hoping for even a 50 basis point cut. The circumstances certainly have improved enormously for a bigger rate cut, but the Reserve Bank is naturally cautious, especially at the beginning of a interest rate cycle. Basically, the cut signals the end of the hiking cycle that we had a few years ago that's plateaued for the last year. And now we're actually going into the cutting cycle. It means that the Reserve Bank is confident that inflation is no longer an upward threat, that it's starting to regain its footing. Though the Reserve Bank were behind the curve, I think every central bank got an inflation surprise, if you like, with interest rates at record low around the world. And so when the interest rate hiking cycle started, it was a bit of a catch-up that they had. So it was a bit of an interest rate shock that occurred around the world, from very low interest rates to pretty lofty levels compared to even a decade previously, since the global financial crisis in 2008. So interest rates have been hiked quite a bit, and inflation now seems to be sort of under control. And I think in South Africa's case, the outlook for inflation is now starting to look extremely positive because of the strength of the rand. Not only the strength of the currency, the persistent strength of the currency, especially post the formation of the government of national unity after the elections that we had earlier this year. That's been yeah.
I want to say, I know I've heard this narrative about a number of these banks being behind the curve. Would a 50 basis point cut have been more appropriate then to catch up?
Well, I think as I said, the Reserve Bank is naturally cautious and conservative, and they're naturally cautious and conservative on the pessimistic and optimistic side. It's not just asymmetric cautiousness. And so at the beginning of the rate cycle, it's not surprising that they actually just started with a 25 basis point cut. But I think if we see the rand continuing to strengthen, the rand plays an extremely important part in determining inflation in South Africa, because we are what they call a small open economy. In other words, we trade a lot with the rest of the world. So if the rand weakens, it filters through to prices very quickly and very easily, and also costs in manufacturing and all that. In other words, input costs and output costs are affected by the rand. So with the strength of the rand, we're seeing a whole heap of positive factors. Fuel prices, for instance, coming down. The only real risk to inflation is administered prices, and it mainly comes from Eskom, which is looking at increases almost 8 to 10 times the inflation rate, to try and stabilize their financial position. But outside that, the inflation risks are at this stage very low, and especially with the increased investor confidence, the prospect of the rand strengthening, not just in the short and medium term, but also in the longer term over the next, say, 2 to 3 years, has the prospect of that occurring. In other words, a repeat of 2001 to 2006, that kind of era that we had in South Africa, where we then had accelerating growth. And it's quite possible we now see growth lift above the population growth rate. I mean, we've had a growth rate that really, you could say, has been at depression levels, because it's been below the population growth rate for certainly more than the last decade. And we now look at the prospect of growth starting to pick up as investor confidence picks up. You're seeing investor confidence pick up in a number of areas, one in the bond market, also in the stock market. You're seeing those numbers improve, but also in the immigration figures are starting to turn around. People are coming back to South Africa, and that's, again, probably one of the most positive signs that you can have in terms of overall confidence and sentiment in a country.
All right, it does sound very encouraging. You mentioned Eskom, and I mean, the conversation has usually been about the load shedding, which has, I guess, been reduced now. You're mentioning them increasing prices for their balance sheet.
Yes.
So is load shedding no longer a conversation now as far as headwinds are concerned for Eskom?
We've got to be careful because we've had periods where load shedding has had a bit of an ebb, and then it's come back in full force again. So in the background, what's important is the rule of law being re-established in Eskom. We had criminal syndicates and gangs that really were intruding into Eskom in quite a big way, and I suspect that what's happening is that these are starting to be, fought against. Very difficult because sometimes it's intertwined with the ruling party, but since the ruling party is now no longer got an absolute majority, it's actually quite positive because now you've got other oversight coming in. The cabinet meetings are no longer just an echo chamber of bad ideas. It's now you've got challenges to those ideas and very constructive challenges. And that's basically where I think growth is going to go. You're going to start seeing positive reforms coming out where you've had an enormous amount of financial repression increasing, which has chased investors away. That financial repression starts to be eased back, and some of the bad ideas softened and maybe even reformed. You may well find that the growth rates can actually sustain, get above even the 3%, get to the 4-5% mark and sustain there for at least a few years, and that will make a difference to unemployment.
Now, Chris, I have to say this, we've talked to you for a number of years. This really is the most optimistic I've heard you talk about the South African economy. Is it due to the unity government? I mean, where is your optimism coming from? Is that where it flows from?
The optimism comes from the unity government, but within the unity government, you're starting to see a bit of a backbone coming in actually tackling crime. For instance, in other words, with the change of the police minister, you're now starting to see, I think, more resolve to tackle crime. That's the first thing, and then with the opposition parties also involved in the rule of law, like for instance the correctional facilities in other areas like agriculture, which is an important part of the actual, the cornerstone in terms of what I call the start of the value chains in South Africa. Is agriculture and mining, very important parts of the actual start of the value chain. We are starting to get, how could you say, fresh thinking that's coming through, and certainly I think the government is certainly a refreshing change to what we have had. And I think, it doesn't matter what government you have had, no government, I think, at this stage will be able to actually rule with a free hand. We're moving to a more European system where you're going to have to work with coalitions. That'll filter eventually down into the municipalities where the worst maladministration is taking place. And with better run municipalities going forward, you may well find that will also help to lay the groundwork, at least where the rubber hits the road, for improved economic activity and investment. The investability at local level becomes much better once you have a better performance at municipal level.
I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about something you're very passionate about, which is unemployment. What is your outlook there? I mean, I guess short-term, long-term, with the optimism that you have now.
Well, I still despair in the sense that the political discourse, usually when one talks about unemployment, the politicians invariably head to what I call as poverty alleviation, which is shifting resources to consumption and it's not really creating jobs as such. It's for poverty alleviation or for poverty reduction is a shift of resources to investment, and that is not, I really don't believe is well understood across the political spectrum. But I think better governance, lower corruption, better rule of law are important elements in generating investment in any case. And I think that getting growth above the getting growth back to the 3 to 4% level will start generating jobs on a fairly wide scale in South Africa. It won't be rapid, but we'll certainly start to see the rate of unemployment drift from the 33% level at the moment, into the upper 20s at least, maybe in 2 years' time.
Fantastic conversation. Chris Hart, Executive Chair at Impact Investment Group. Thank you so much for the insights in South Africa. I really appreciate your time, sir.